Talisman skills here, video number 12, Sidutru continue. Okay. Question is, what's the whole association with pitchforks and broomsticks associated specifically with warlocks and witches? What was with that? It's actually very simple, and it's kind of nasty how it was started. Basically, because people in the country still, the surrounding country, were still adhering to a lot of their traditional beliefs. It was assumed that all farmers and their wives were warlocks and witches when this wasn't the case, but it didn't stop them from using that as propaganda to pitch a lot of the nonsense. So warlocks were viewed as supposedly flying around in their delusional state on pitchforks representing the farmer, and the broom was associated with the wife, who supposedly got whacked out and thought they were flying around. Basically, they thought that they were tweaking on shrooms or something else, and having hallucinations, thinking that they were going off these so-called things. But that's actually stuff doesn't really occur until like the 1700s. In a lot of the art previous to that, there's very little of that specifically added. That's kind of like a later add-on. It's kind of a misrepresentation of what people were actually telling them, but also that ongoing lost definition by association and then embellishment into mythology. So that's really where that comes from. And a classic example would be looking at like the so-called mom plot hill on the farm, otherwise called American Gothic, where that's pretty much the symbolism there. It's the farmer with the pitchfork and the wife sitting, standing next to him, and they both look rather pissed off at the world. Kind of almost a surreal type imagery. But yeah, look that up, and that kind of gives you the real clue there why that comes from. Now the question comes from, where did the representation of warlocks and witches with pointy hats originate? Well, that's actually a later artistic addition, but it actually has some interesting history behind it. And this is legitimate. Most people say, well, nobody really knows, and that's not true. And I'll tell you basically how this went down. Having hats like the Quakers, it kind of went up a bit, right? And then, flattened off at the top. Whereas women, especially, ladies of privilege, we'll say, had their special, headdress decorations. Those traditionally comes out with a point and has the little whatever's hanging from it and whatnot. It was actually common dress. And it was a fashion that was continued on by people throughout the rest of the country until some folks arbitrarily, like around the 1600s or some shit, pretty much declared that all pointed objects or pointed hats must somehow represent horns, and therefore all horns represent the devil. So they have to be banned because it's against God. They obviously didn't read their Bible, but that didn't matter. That just kind of shows how some dictator could randomly come up with some nonsense like that, and because of their position, it would have to be honored. But a lot of the common people in the towns and cities and surrounding areas, instead of the royalty, which got a lot of their wealth from the Roman Catholic Church by way of the Vatican and from the wealth of Rome. And that's how they got a lot of their support for their various campaigns and territorial disputes and conquest, before it became a war over that bullshit between Protestants and Catholics. And it was also called a mockery of the Pope's tiara. So people stopped wearing it, and over time it eventually has kind of faded out of fashion anyhow. So because of that, story there was other parodies done with the whole Puritans that would use the Pope's tiara and kind of use the same concept. Well, if it represents the devil, then the Pope must be the devil. So a little bit of sarcasm went into having elongated versions of the Pope tiaras, which actually appears in one of Goya's paintings called The Flight of the Witches, where it's 3 female witches snatching up a victim planning on eating him. But they are actually wearing short hair, which is actually symbolic, supposedly, humiliation of women. So these were considered ungodly women because of their short, cut hair. But they were also considered cannibalistic monsters at that time. So 3 witches, old lore, 3 she-demon consorts of God turned into the devil. And that kind of rest of it is part of the history there. So that evolved in a rather short period of time from some of these later classical paintings. But where you go to the earlier woodcuts, you got people wearing flat hats, bonnets, and things like that were supposedly warlocks and witches. Some of the headgear that's represented is, a bad representation of some of the actual native indigenous peoples' ceremonial headdresses. So that's just, some more examples. But then it's later on to the artistic invention because of some Pope's random decree. Became kind of a creation out of sarcasm, as well as humor. But then, other artists embellished the creepy element, because that's just what some artists do. And it just kind of stuck. It was one of those things that kind of caught on. So that's really how that went. And then you also got to take into consideration too, around the 1800s, as a symbol of humiliation and mockery, it was also required that somebody would wear an outfit with kind of a twisted version of the Pope's hat. If they were a heretic, they were forced to dress like that as a form of humiliation and parade around town like that. And basically be spit on and everything else and not be able to retaliate without being then executed. Because they deserved to be humiliated. That was kind of how it was played out. Really some serious psychological abuse done to everybody, huh? But hey, that's the times. So pretty much anything that was used as mockery or humiliation or a way of accusing your rival party of something, you took these symbols from, like, Catholics, Pope's hats, and you warped it a little bit. Or you took something like the Puritans and their Quaker hats and you warped it a little bit. And then over time they just kind of merged together and you end up with the traditional view, while still echoing the fact that people were already wearing pointed caps and hats and headdresses long before that among many different cultures. And when people started seeing that over in these other cultures caps were common, that's where they also started assuming that warlocks and witches were all over the planet in service with the devil of the world. And it's doom, we must fight it all and destroy every one of those, and the rest is cycle of history. So it has an evolution from several sources that inspired artists, and it was just a matter of time for finding it into what now is usually thought of as a warlock or witch's hat. Supposedly the wizard's cap. Again, the term didn't even come about until the 1500s for that particular term, but it was a common hat, just a common style. No different, interestingly enough, than the old nightcaps with the extremely long back ends, and they flipped it over or whatever. Think of like Ichabod Crane and all that. So, yeah. That was probably also had an influence too, because since the warlocks and witches were things in nightmares and the cap represents sleep, why not just slap that in together? So, hey, guess what? We have another addition to that. So we're going to play the nightmare thing off on this one, and voila. The rest is horror movie classics and a whole lot of paranoia. So, Again, it evolved from several sources. Did warlocks and witches actually hop around on broomsticks and all that stuff? No. The people will tell you they did for some kind of fertility rite. They're yanking your dick and twisting your titties with nonsense, and giving you basically a mental purple nurple. Should punch them for that. Really hard. Wands were used, but not in the context people think of them today. Some did have staffs, but those originated from spears that people had with them, and the different decorations represented levels of achievement, you know, from apprentice to teacher, and that's, again, tribal customs. You can see a lot of that even in tribal cultures that existed in Africa and other regions, but that's, you know, it's the same thing. It represented achievements. Some of the things in Madagascar are good examples among those cultures. So there you go. It's not hard to figure out. It's hard to understand why people can't seem to figure it out. That amazes me. Frustrates. On to the next video.